author, columnist, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, talk show host, and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we are talking political philosophies, socialism, capitalism, and the filibuster, and a whole lot more. It's going to be quite the show. Remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined today for a long-form discussion on political philosophy, what it means to be living in a republic and a democracy, as some people say, and really what those questions are brought through from the very fact of where we are. And that is Mr. Tim Don, a longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, let's kick this off with I think it's one of the most important questions that we could examine, and that is really a function of the republic, or the democracy, as some people call it, and that is the filibuster. And obviously, it's gone through many iterations in terms of what it allows and what parliamentary precedents really sets for it within Congress. But Tim, overall, is it good or bad for the system of governance that we have?
Well, this is a question that's going to become very current very soon, I would suggest, Mark. Donald Trump, famously suggested that they trash the filibuster in the Senate in order to end the government shutdown. It didn't turn out to be necessary. But one thing you have in the Senate that you don't have in the House is the necessity for a 60 vote 60 votes for any legislation to pass. Now, there's a number of different views on this. Trump's view, in terms of the current day, is that if you don't get rid of the filibuster now, the Democrats are going to do it anyway. So you might as well do it when you have a chance to push through legislation with just 51 votes, rather than keep it at 60 and then let the Democrats, as Trump and Republicans believe they will do, get rid of the filibuster the next time they have control of the Senate. Look, there's nothing in the founding documents or the Constitution about a filibuster. And at the same time, the filibuster is sort of very pro-democratic in the sense, I would say pro-Republican, small r Republican, because the intent of the founders was to make legislation very difficult to pass. The point was that you wanted to have a broad consensus before any major legislation is passed. So the question is, over time, whether the filibuster is pro or anti small d democratic. And I think you could get answers on both sides. From my standpoint, I think the filibuster is an important check on a minority or a majority overrunning the minority in the Senate. And a lot of people think it's the only thing that we have that stops, that really stops a majority party from changing everything when they are in power.
Yeah, what is it? Two wolves voting on eating a lamb for dinner.
Yes, essentially, yes.
But so let me play devil's advocate on this a little bit, which is, and that is, if it's so valuable for the Senate, because you want deliberation, right? You want things to be deliberative. You want them to be well thought out and not at the whim of just the 50 plus one, right? 50% plus one.
Yes.
So you want that. Then why don't we have that for the House of Representatives?
Well, it's a good question, and it's an historical question. The Senate adopted it mostly because it is the upper chamber, which is supposed to reflect the views of, individual states rather than individual districts. Congress, the House of Representatives, is considered the the body that is closest to the people.
Yeah.
Because each congressional district is obviously smaller than the state that it is in. Although you have some states that only have one congressman and two senators. A state like Wyoming, for example, that's a low population state. The other thing is that, Democrats have always felt that they were at a built-in unfair disadvantage because of the number of red states that have one congressman and two members of the Senate. Why should Wyoming have the same number of senators as California, for example? So, the filibuster has become a feature of our constitutional republic. But the House just operates on very different rules, and than the Senate, and I'm not sure that there was ever a serious move for a filibuster in the House like there has been in the Senate for decades.
Yeah, there's I guess the purpose behind it is obviously to stop rash acts from, for example, a populist who gets in and has one term to wreak havoc, is the idea. Which, looking back over history, that makes sense, right? Because you have, for example, and of course I'm heading back to the Roman Empire here, but your populists would come in saying, we need to burn this down, we need to start all this again, we need to do everything. But then, of course, as soon as they're in power, they become the old guard, and then so the next lot come in, and we're the populists. But I guess it's a bulwark against an actual populist, because if somebody managed to get in with a party, for example, a new MAGA movement, or Elon Musk's floundering, well, I guess it never really took off, America party, but getting in on all the excitement, and then upturning everything. But then, of course, we'll never get elected again because they've upturned everything, which has created chaos. But then, of course, they've got to the deliberative bodies have to undo that particular damage. Now, the question is, though, if the people vote for the populists, shouldn't they get what they want?
Well, populists, by their very nature, are people without any North Star political philosophy.
Sure.
Essentially, they're people who respond to what the people want. And that's good and that's bad. It's good because they're giving people what they actually want. They are representing the views of the common man and woman. But the downside is that those whims of the public are fleeting and change. I don't think there was any appetite for MAGA 15 years ago, but there certainly is now. And, you mentioned about the establishment. I mean, think about this statement and how things have changed. It's 2016. Donald Trump is the establishment now.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is the establishment. I had to repeat that because it's hard to see it that way. But seeing that he's won 2 terms in office and now holds control of the Senate and the House, the GOP does, they are the establishment. So hard to say when a move might be made on this issue of the filibuster. But I suspect that the discussion of it will grow substantially as we head towards midterms, because which still seems unlikely, the Democrats seize control of the Senate, the idea among Trump and Republicans is that they will immediately move to remove the filibuster, even though anything they pass that isn't pro the Republican point of view, of course, would be vetoed by President Trump until early 2029.
Yeah, it's almost like there's getting rid of the filibuster. It's like the purpose of having nuclear weapons, right? It's mutually assured destruction. If you get rid of it, you never quite know what's going to come down the pipeline.
Well, I think that the Republicans are also responding to what Democrats tried to do when Joe Biden won the presidency. If they had their way, and it wasn't for Joe Manchin and probably Kirsten Sinema, the two moderate Democrats, we might already have seen the Supreme Court packed with left-wing justices. We might have seen
Puerto Rico as a state.
Puerto Rico and D.C. become states, which means 4 locked Democratic senators for as far as the eye can see. So these are the kind of things that Republicans are going to warn against, that, especially with the Democratic Party moving further and further and further to the left. They could take some drastic actions that will become effectively irreversible, that would change the face of the republic if the filibuster was eliminated.
In the words of the great prophet and sage Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might just get what you need. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, one in the same man, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for sticking around, Tim.
Thank you, Mark.
Now, moving on from our Jagger-esque discussions earlier in the show, let's talk about what it means to be a populist movement. And you mentioned earlier that Donald Trump is now the establishment, and that raises a very important question, isn't it? Does the MAGA movement survive beyond Donald Trump's second term?
Well, I think there's several possible answers to that. But the first one, we might step back in time to the Tea Party movement that sort of formed around 2009, 2010. And they had a big impact on the body politic, so to speak, but they were dealing with a rather popular and unique historic figure in Barack Obama. And it was Mitt Romney, who ran in 2012, who was really the polar opposite of the Tea Party movement. So that movement never came to the point of real power, although they did have some individual representatives and some senators that were, Tea Party friendly, to be sure. But when Trump
and one notable governor.
and one notable governor. But that was a movement. Some people thought it died, but it really didn't. It became dormant like a volcano and then exploded when Donald Trump came back on the scene and was the effective end result of the Tea Party movement in some senses. Now, as far as MAGA goes, there's one thing we can count on for sure, which is by the time Donald Trump leaves office on January 20th, 2029, the country is going to be exhausted of Donald Trump, whether they love him or hate him. We know this as journalists. Covering Donald Trump and his administration is an exhausting enterprise because he's a perpetual motion machine. There's always something happening, and there's not enough time for people like us on LibertyNation.com to cover all of it. So given that, and the fact that you probably have a MAGA disciple in the wings in J.D. Vance, not so much Marco Rubio, but to some degree Rubio as well. I think it all comes down to whether the radical changes that Donald Trump is making, particularly to the economy in terms of tariffs and some of his more controversial policies, if they're a success, I think we're looking at the kind of thing we saw in 1988 when George H.W. Bush essentially served the third term of Ronald Reagan and was victorious, even though he was not a great candidate. So J.D. Vance would be in that same position to carry on the popularity of Donald Trump if he's still popular. But I can tell you this, too, that if over the next 3 years, the economy does not recover the way that he hopes, and the tariffs wind up reigniting inflation, then I think that the Republican Party will pivot back to someone more conventional, like a Glenn Youngkin or maybe a Marco Rubio. So it really, I hate to say it because it's such a well-worn expression, but it is the economy, stupid. It was the economy under Ronald Reagan that essentially got Bush elected in '88. And it would be the economy of Donald Trump's second term that would get the MAGA movement to carry on. But of course, if it carries on, it's not going to carry on forever.
Yeah.
The question is, what kind of a permanent imprint MAGA will have made on the Republican Party? And it's going to be substantial no matter what, because a lot of these changes that Donald Trump is making are essentially irreversible. For example, they're not going to rehire thousands of federal workers. Okay,
well, not on the first day, right?
Not on the first day. They're not going to raise the taxes that were reduced in the one big beautiful bill, and they're not going to open the border to all comers like during the Biden administration. So some of these changes will be permanent and imprinted in the Republican brand, but I think it pivots on whether, like Reaganism, the Trump economy soars or hiccups or tumbles.
I think that it's a great analogy that you've made there, or a great connection that you made with Ronald Reagan moving on to George H.W. Bush and Donald Trump moving on to whoever that happens to be, as you say. Currently, if things continue on the present trajectory, that looks like J.D. Vance, I would suggest.
Yes.
But obviously, when George H.W. Bush came in, he came in promising to be a third term of Ronald Reagan, but then he governed as George H.W. Bush, and that's why he didn't get a second term, right?
Well, he effectively ended Reaganism when he did it with one basic phrase that was attached to him forever, and that is, we need a kinder, gentler nation. And then Nancy Reagan responded to that by saying, kinder and gentler than what?
Yeah.
Or who? And that really put a stake through the heart of Reaganism, because Republicans became very wary of heading back towards the traditional establishment Republicanism. I don't think J.D. Vance is the same situation, because he is a true believer in MAGA. And
the converts are obvious. The late life converts always tend to be the stronger believers, right?
The board again MAGA believers are stronger than even the original ones. Yes, because the converted person is the more radical person in their beliefs.
Yeah. So, do you think there's one final question? Just 20 seconds on this. Do you think there's a space for Vivek Ramaswamy in the future movement? Because he was a bundle of energy in getting Trump back to the White House.
We shouldn't sleep on him. He's running for governor of Ohio, and he may well win. And if he does, he is in the mix for 2028. And if the Republican loses in 2028, you've got to expect Ramaswamy to come back in 2032, because he's still very young.
Very true. We're going to be back with Tim after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation on political philosophies and different elements within that with Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for sticking around, Tim.
Always fun to talk with you, Mark.
So I want to go a bit, I won't say left field, all right, let's go outfield on this. And I want to talk about the idea of political entrepreneurs. And this ties in quite well with what we've talked about earlier in the show. And to me, a political entrepreneur is somebody who, let's say there's a whole range of tick boxes that you have to do to become a successful politician within Western liberal democracies. No, I'm talking just general ones, not the, you got to be female, you got to be black, and then you can get on the Supreme Court. Not like that, but or Joe Biden's vice president. But there are certain things that's expected of our politicians, which is why we always hear this this trumpet call about how he doesn't have the experience, or she was the most qualified candidate ever, because we expect, or we allegedly expect, certain qualifications, history, that kind of stuff. But there are a couple of figures that I think that have broken that particular system. They've created their own political marketplaces by being as individualistic as possible. And yet they've kind of stuck. Now, we see it a lot. A lot of people, the guy who promised 2 mules for everybody and has ran in every presidential election for the last 30 years.
40 acres and a mule.
40 acres and a mule. So there's a lot of people who have their own brand, but they don't make it into the big marketplace of politics. And yet you have people like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage on the other side of the Atlantic. And these people are already charting their own courses. And I wonder if there's a recipe behind what they're doing that others would seek to emulate.
I don't think there's a recipe, which is why it would be an entrepreneurial enterprise for a lot of these people to come into the political process. Donald Trump broke every political norm. I mean, by all accounts, viewed through a traditional political lens, he should have lost about 40 to 45 states to Hillary Clinton, who checked every single box of the traditional metrics that one, expects from a presidential candidate, other than the fact she wasn't black. That was about the only box that she didn't check. And yet she lost, and lost reasonably decisively to a guy who so many Americans thought he had no business running for president, not to mention being president. But I think what he did was not necessarily create MAGA as a permanent political brand, so much as to say you can win and you can appeal to people by breaking the mold. Now, I think there's a couple of other people who fall into this class. A 29-year-old bartender from Queens has become one of the most popular figures in the Democratic Party, to the point that she's being discussed as a Senate candidate in 2028, perhaps even a presidential candidate in 28 or beyond.
I'm going to push back on you just a fraction there, because we're talking about
Alexandria
Schumer, of course, being the barmaid. No, yes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But she's not. It's not as though she was a wildfire in and of herself. She was picked by the Justice Democrats, which is a very powerful group. There's a lot of funding behind her. She had the Democratic Socialists of America behind her as well, and she was a candidate for them before she became a candidate for office. And so I'm not sure if I would class her in the same thing. But please make your case.
Well, there were a lot of people that wanted Donald Trump to run for office too. Yeah. Probably a lot more that didn't.
Yeah, but not as a Republican.
In the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But look, he came in and single-handedly reversed the branding of the parties. You think about it. For as long as we could remember before 2016, the Republicans were party of the party of the rich, the party of corporations, and the party of well-heeled white people. It's now reversed. After a decade of Trump, the Republicans have now become the party of the working class, and the Democrats have become the party of the rich elites. Now, we've seen these kind of switches before, like in the early 60s, when the Civil Rights Law was passed. Suddenly, the solid South turned from solid Democrat to solid Republican because of civil rights provisions. And that flipped the sort of electoral narrative, shall we say, the electoral map. It flipped it. So it really is a matter of not so much what the movement is, as much as it is in the case of Trump or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Zoran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York, that you can win by doing things you're not supposed to be able to do and win, like calling yourself a democratic socialist, or like AOC being, shall we say, not the most knowledgeable person when it comes to history and politics, and yet she created a brand. I think what all of this has done is said that traditional politics is pretty much out the window because MAGA has taken over the Republican Party and left-wing socialism has become the dominant driving force in the Democratic Party.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's very rare in history when there's such a, obviously not unprecedented by a long shot, but it's rare when you can actually see two parties, the two dominant parties, the two prime spheres of influence, almost change what they are. Yes. But we're actually watching it in real time, aren't we? Because
yes,
the Republicans, it is the MAGA is the Republican Party now, and woe betide anybody who runs on a George W. Bush style ticket in 2028. These I don't think these gentlemen or ladies will make it through the anywhere near to the top of the primaries. And then, of course, with the Democrats, they're wrestling. The Democratic Party is wrestling right now with should they try and emulate the success to hold on to power at the cost of their blue dog Democrat base, which now I see a lot of this is why Trump won, I guess. A lot of the blue dog Democrats they switched to Donald Trump after the Joe Biden Kamala Harris debacle. And so we're seeing that right now. It's a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. And I think the Democratic socialist wing of the party, the more what we would now consider far left side of the party, I think they're going to win because they have been winning in races and they've been winning by a lot. Now, it was no surprise that a Democrat would win the New York City mayoralty election, but over 1 million votes cast just for that candidate. That's energy. And a party that wants to survive, it has to choose whether they're going to keep their core principles or opt for power and then hope they can get back to their principles later on. And I suspect it's the latter. What do you think?
Well, I think we saw in almost exact terms in the personification of the three major races that we saw here in 2025. You saw two relative moderates, traditional liberals, winning the gubernatorial races in New Jersey with Jackie Sherrill and in Virginia with Mikey Sherrill. Did I say Jackie?
Yes.
I think that was an athlete.
There you go.
Some kind of, I don't remember. Anyway, and then Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. These are the kind of Democrats that the general consensus says these are the type of Democrats that can win, to talk about core issues, as opposed to Zoran Mamdani, who went as far left as you could possibly go in winning the race in New York City, which of course is, other than Seattle, probably the most democratic city, the most liberal, the most leftist city in the country. So they have a real reckoning. And what it's going to take for the Democrats to figure it out is probably a figure like a Bill Clinton who can come in and say, look, we lost to Trump twice and shame on us because we couldn't figure him out. We didn't try to figure him out. And we need to go back to the point where we're starting to appeal to the working class again, instead of talking about climate change and transgenderism and open borders and all of this crazy left-wing stuff that people don't care about. And one thing that Zoran Mamdani did to bring ironically, to bring the party kind of back to reality is that he appealed to the affordability issue. And I think, if I was Mamdani right now, I would get out there and say, look how prescient I was by talking about affordability and winning the New York City mayoral race, because no less than President Trump has now pivoted to an affordability agenda. So I think Mamdani hit on something, even though his solutions for affordability are going to prove to be disastrous if history is any guide at all. But it also means Trump knows that over the next year, the economy better improve the way that he projects it to improve if he hopes to have the House stave off losing control to the Democrats in 2026.
We're going to continue the conversation about whether socialism can get a foothold in a nominally democratic constitutional republic after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio for our final segment. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation Senior Principal Analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Tim, we've been touching on this issue on and off throughout the show today. But there is a growing call for more socialism in America at the moment. If anybody wants proof, Zohran Mamdani in New York just won over 1 million votes in New York City. And bear in mind, like for the last 30 years, there hasn't even been 1 million votes cast in that race. And so it seems to me that there's an appetite for it, for some more socialism than already exists, as it were. But do you think it can ever really can it gain a foothold in America so it becomes a permanent part of the body politic?
No, it won't become the prevailing political philosophy in the United States because we have always been, or at least for as far back as the eye can see, or as far as we can remember, socialism has never worked. And
sure.
Socialistic policies have failed and been overturned, not just in the U.S., but we see it in a place like Sweden, which was pointed to as a exemplar of proper socialism until they ran out of money in Sweden. The old Margaret Thatcher statement that the problem with socialism is that you eventually run
out of other
people's money. And that was what happened in Sweden. And you now see other European Union nations who are starting to really turn away from more clearly socialistic policies. I think the problem, Mark, is that this issue is presented as a binary choice, capitalism versus socialism. And what that does do is it takes the people who've been left behind by capitalism, by the cost of living, the cost of housing, and it says, well, capitalism isn't doing anything for us, so I guess we'll embrace socialism, even though they don't know all that entails. So I think it's more a referendum on the popularity of capitalism than it is on a thirst for socialism.
Yeah, that does make sense. Actually, I talked about this on very briefly on last week's Liberty Nation Radio with our economics guru, Andrew Moran. And I made a point that you have all these young people and they're looking away from the free market system and they're looking at socialism because they don't have anything. You know, they don't have money, they don't have housing, they don't own a home. And it occurred to me then, and I made that point then, I'll make it again now, is that of course they don't have anything. They're young. You don't have anything when you're young. You know, it takes a lifetime to build up, you know, some money, a home, you know, get yourself out of your debts, things like that. It takes time. But I worry that because it's become so acceptable to be socialist now, even communist, I mean, that blows a brief aside here that people openly say, I'm a communist. And I think, would people say the same thing, like say that so proudly that they're Nazis, you know, in terms of the amount of death and destruction that ideology has caused? But if they opt for socialism at a young age because it's now so acceptable to say, of course I'm a socialist, things like this, then they might not ever get the opportunity to take advantage of the free market system that people naturally take advantage of as they just get older. Because that's life, right? You don't start out with you're not born and you've got a property and a portfolio when you're born. You have to work for the things over a period of time, and then you appreciate it more as well because you've spent your time working for it. You've been hungry, you've been broke. And I wonder that because it's so popular now, this amongst the young, this idea that socialism can give us what we need, that they're never going to experience the true fruits of a free market economy.
I think there's one thing in particular that has caused this spike in the acceptability of socialism. After the pandemic, which was a ruination for the country to a degree we didn't even understand at the time, the cost of the average home has doubled since the pandemic. And it means now that the average entry-level person or family into the owning a home used to be as low as 26 years old, and it's now over 40. So you have to be over 40 on average to be able to afford to buy your own home. This means that young people can't own a piece of the American dream. We become a nation of renters rather than owners. And that's we could do a whole show on the dangers of being a nation of renters rather than owners. So I think it's the effect of the pandemic that made everything so expensive, particularly housing, and seemingly out of reach to so many young people, that has them, open to the idea of socialism. And remember, one other thing about Mamdani in terms of the brilliance of his campaign was not just that he hit on affordability, which was the key issue and should be the key issue, but the fact that he targeted that message at young people who have no recollection. Many weren't alive during the particular excesses of socialism and communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Cuba. They didn't live through that. They're not scared of that. They didn't see that. They don't know about it. They haven't studied it. They just see socialism means a lot of free stuff for me. Therefore, hey, why wouldn't I support it?
So doesn't that mean that there is a growing foothold? And how does one repel that battlefront of socialism, Tim? Just a short answer. If you can come with a short answer on that particular subject.
Well, I think, capitalism has to, again, work for more people than it's working for now. The problem really comes down to we have a vibrant upper class and a well-protected lower class, but it's the middle class that has suffered, and we have to strengthen the middle. If we strengthen the middle class, we strengthen capitalism.
Words to live by there, Tim Donner. Thanks ever so much for joining us on today's show.
A lot of fun, Mark. Thanks for having me.
And that's about all we have time for in this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our special guest today, longtime host of this here radio show, and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there, who tune in each and every week to join in the conversation. You are appreciated. Please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.